So Ode to the West Wind is a bit of an outlier really with Shelley, because for the first time really in the four poems actually in the collection that we actually get, I won't say a happy Shelley, but a slightly more optimistic Shelley at least. This poem is about essentially his hopes for change, and it's less wallowy, it's less self-pitying than he has been. It almost feels like he actually thinks something might quite happen. So key things to know are on the left there, that this is in the terza rima form. So what that means is the stanzas all have three lines where the first and third lines rhyme, but then the second line is rhymed with the first and third lines in the next stanza. Okay, so the second line of one stanza then is rhymed with the first and third line of the next one, and so on. So it's constantly repeating itself, constantly echoing itself. It's based on a style actually that was originally used by minstrels, like travelling singers, travelling storytellers. So again, Shelley's deliberately using that pastoral style, that the language of the common man that Wordsworth talks about. But Dante uses it as well, the great Italian poet. So there's an argument you could say that Shelley's telling us to go back to a simpler time, hence the terza rima form. You could also argue perhaps that this is a reference to the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son and the Holy Spirit in those three lines. Well, obviously Shelley as an atheist might perhaps be given a twist on that. Is this Shelley's own religion? Is this basically Shelley going, this is what I believe in? So key things I tend to ask are in that blue box on the right. What does the West Wind represent? Why do you think Shelley chooses to use this terza rima? What are the best three links to context? And the best three comments on Shelley's use of language you can think of. And top right box, key thing, a very controversial thing that Shelley said. He said quite a few controversial things. But this one, he said that in Paradise Lost, so John Milton, this kind of, hero, you could say hero of the Enlightenment, Shelley argues that Milton really was on Satan's side. He says that Milton's a poet, Milton's not an artist, and any artist is on Satan's side, even if they don't know it. You could perhaps say that this changes how you view the poem. Satan in Paradise Lost, he's the guy who wants to sort of tear everything down and start again. Is this what Shelley's doing in this poem? And I've asked a lot of other romantic poems also feature an anti-hero. Byron Shelley's the original kind of romantic anti-hero. So in terms of further explanation, something else to be aware of, the West Wind, obviously America is in the West, and there's an argument that the West Wind refers to America. Shelley's hoping that this wind of change comes from America and will change Britain. He sees American society as more equal. There's no king or queen in America. There's a Declaration of Independence which states we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Very much appeals to Shelley, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness. These are the things that Shelley kind of believes in himself, and you could argue again that this is Shelley's kind of raison d'etre. In other words, this is him saying, this is what I believe in, this is what we should do, this is my own version of religion. So without further ado, let's look at this poem here. Quite a long one, so I'll have to sort of go through it quite quickly, but Oh, wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, thou from whose unseen presence the leaves dead are driven like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing. Wordsworth also talks about fleeing, doesn't he? When you're young, you flee, you don't even realise that you're at one with nature. But in this sense, Shelley's saying we need to get rid of the dead wood. We need to change society, yellow and black and pale and hectic red. We've had the yellow before in The Cold Earth Slept Below, an image of decay and death. Pestilence-stricken multitudes, O thou who charitest to thy dark wintry bed. Again, Cold Earth Slept Below, dark wintry bed. A lot of the images are the same, but what Shelley's saying is we need death, we need stuff to come in to get rid of all this, to cut away the dead wood so that we can perhaps start again. The winged seeds where they lie cold and low, again the cold earth slept below, lots of references there, each like a corpse within its grave until thine azure sister of the spring shall blow her clarion o'er the dreaming earth and fill driving sweet buds like flocks to feed in air with living hues and odours plain and hill. So this constant echoing is perhaps also the west wind of autumn and winter followed by spring, you know, the kind of death and life side by side. That's what we're getting in this poem. You need the death to, give space for the life to grow, for spring to come. And then you get this couplet at the end of each part. Wild spirit, which art moving everywhere, destroyer and preserver, hear, oh hear. So that exclamative, that couplet which gives perhaps a bit more urgency, a slightly more direct tone by Shelley, speaking directly to that wind, hear, oh hear. They're crying out, almost like he feels like he's part of something, almost like he's railing against the world and feels like he's got a bit of an answer here. There on whose stream, mid the steep sky's commotion, loose clouds like earth's decaying leaves are shed, shook from the tangled boughs of heaven and ocean, angels of rain and lightning there are spread on the blue surface of thine airy surge, like the bright hair uplifted from the head of some fierce maenad, even from the dim verge of the horizon to the zenith's height, the locks of the approaching storm, thou dirge of the dying year, to which this closing night will be the dome of a vast sepulchre. So again, lots of imagery of death, which we had, we've had in Shelley poetry before, the dirge, the dying year, the sepulchre, the heavens here, the lightning. But again, this sense that actually there's also the uplifted that comes in that, the zenith, these images of height and being, kind of at the top. So again, it's light and shade in this poem. We need the decay to kind of reach up to the heavens, to the zeniths, to the heights. It's necessary to sort of promote social change. Vaulted with all thy congregated might, and again, congregation. Blake has criticised congregations before in the Holy Thursday poems. Shelley's sort of doing the same thing here. Of vapours from whose solid atmosphere black rain and fire and hail will burst, oh here. Notice that at the end, black rain and fire and hail will burst, oh here. The iambic pentameter used by Shelley, but it feels a little bit odd actually, doesn't it? It doesn't feel gentle in the way that many of Shakespeare's sonnets do. It's got, I think, the real real urgency with the exclamative at the end, with the fire, the hail, the rain, the burst. Actually, this almost feels more like Blake. Think about in Tiger with the fires and the rains and the stars throwing down their spears, the black. So you've got this real kind of at odds here that the form and structure of the poem in that line actually normally is quite a gentle form and structure. It's what Wordsworth uses in Daffodils, and yet the language here, you get the plosives of the black and the burst, which is exactly what Blake uses. The imagery of rain and fire and hail. So Shelley's kind of mixing those two things, almost mixing perhaps the best of Wordsworth and Blake to give him this sense of urgency. He's taking the romantic movement and he's moving it forward. And yes, it might be painful, and yes, it might go against some of what we like, but he's seeing this as urgent and needed. Thou who didst waken from his summer dreams, the blue Mediterranean where he lay, lulled by the coil of his crystalline streams. Is Shelley talking about himself here? He's moaned, hasn't he, about being in the Mediterranean, in Naples, and being half asleep and being moany. Notice he's on about thou who didst waken. He's on about, he's kind of waking himself up. He's almost like he's having a go at himself, like, come on, gotta get a grip. Beside a pumice isle in Bayer's Bay, and soar in sleep are palaces and towers, quivering within the waves' intense day. The waves knocking down these towers, Dickens refers to the towers of Babel in hard times, doesn't he, that need to be brought down. All overgrown with azure moss and flowers, so sweet, the sense faints picturing them, thou for whose path the Atlantic's level powers cleave themselves into chasms. Note again the sea scent, that cleave into chasms, while far below the sea blooms and the oozy woods which wear the sapless foliage of the ocean know. So again, notice that iambic pentameter, the sea blooms and the oozy woods which wear, if I exaggerate it. But this poem feels very, very different to what you'd expect from a poem in iambic pentameter. Again, the cleaving, the chasms, the powers of the Atlantic, the quivering, those two things are a little bit at odds here. I guess, he's sort of straining against his own kind of romantic sensibilities to create something very, very different. Notice we have got a lot of the classic romantic imagery. It's imagery that Shelley himself has used in stanzas written in Dejection near Naples. But he's taking this and giving, like I say, a bit of an argument, a bit of a manifesto of what he wants. Thy voice and suddenly grow grey with fear, and tremble and despoil themselves, oh here. So again, notice the fear, the crying out. It's a lot like Blake. Very, very odd poem in the sense of the form and structure seem to be struggling against each other. The language and form and structure don't seem to quite match here. If you want to be cynical, could you argue that actually this is because Shelley's a bit uncomfortable doing this? The other three poems are essentially Shelley whinging about things and knowing that he's doing it and being self-aware. there's a real strain in this one. I think the terza rima, which on the one hand is exactly what Shelley wants, but then also the iambic form doesn't quite seem to go with the sort of language here. It's a kind of beautiful contradiction, this one, I think, partly because it's so at odds with what he's done. It's almost like he's using the stuff that he's used in his poetry before, and deconstructing it and putting it in a new form to try and give it, you know, a kind of a sense of oomph, for want of a better word. Almost like he's giving himself a slap in the face and taking all his imagery and going, right, come on, we've got to do something about it. If I were a dead leaf thou mightst bear, if I were a swift cloud to fly with thee, a wave to pant beneath thy power and share the impulse of thy strength, only less free than thou art uncontrollable. Shelley's desire to be borne up by this west wind. He sees himself simply as a dead leaf or a swift cloud, an inanimate object that's part of something bigger, and maybe that's the reason for the contradiction. For Shelley, this isn't about him. This is about a wider movement. He's just a dead leaf that is a part of it. And again, that self-awareness and that melancholy nature and the fact that he feels unappreciated, we perhaps get here. The wind is the important thing. That's what, you know, that's what we need going forward. Notice the uncontrollable, the exclamation mark. That's what makes it so beautiful. Again, ironically, in quite a controlled poem, Shelley's glorying at the uncontrollable nature of the west wind. Maybe he's acknowledging here his own weakness as just one man who isn't who can only be a tiny part of this. He can't give this kind of manifest on its own. It's a wider movement. If even I were as in my boyhood and could be the comrade of thy wanderings over heaven, as then when to outstrip thy skiey speed scarce seemed a vision I would ne'er have striven. Notice again, just like Wordsworth, he's looking back at when he was young saying, I didn't know what I'd got. If only I was young again, I'd outstrip you, but no, I can't quite. As thus with thee in prayer in my sore need, oh lift me as a wave, a leaf, a cloud, I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed. Notice these repeated exclamatives, the bleeding, the idea of Shelley wanting to give everything that he is to this movement. A heavy weight of hours has chained and bowed, one too like thee, tameless, swift and proud. Again, like Blake, we get the chains, the mind-forged manacles Blake talks about. He sees himself as bowed. He sees himself as being weighed down by the hours, whereas the wind is tameless and swift and proud. The wind is everything Shelley wants to be, but isn't, and I think that's where we get to the heart of the contradiction in this poem. Shelley himself, the guy who wrote the poem, is controlled, is weighed down, is weak, is melancholic, is self-aware, and actually he's saying all those things, and that's why he's straining against this form of the poem. He knows that the wind is something else, and I think he kind of gets used to that contradiction at the end, and he's okay with it. Probably more okay than he's ever been in any of his other poetry.